There's a lot at stake. Thanks be to God, it doesn't always feel like that. Sometimes what's at stake is just what color you want the trim paint to be. Pure white, if you must know. I think I'm still wearing it today. Other times the stakes are a lot bigger. Things like, what career am I going to change to? Or is it time to sell the house? I think in those big stake kind of moments, we get to ask questions that we don't even think about when we're drowning in the questions of trim paint. We get to ask big questions like, is the God that they talk about in this Bible really the only way to know God? Or if that God is real, then does he know me? Could he protect me? Would he protect me? In our story today, we're asking the high stakes questions. And we're asking them through this guy, Daniel, who was a subversive leader who lived a quiet life in a big role in a foreign country. And I think sometimes we can feel like those kind of subversive leaders that are living quiet lives, and the stakes don't feel all that high until suddenly they do. And then our lives feel like they're unraveling in the same way. Maybe unraveling is the wrong word, but follow through the same storyline that all great stories go through. As the moment of crisis where the stakes are laid out and then the plan unfolds and then the action happens as we see whether or not that plan is going to work, and then we get to live into the outcome for a little while. All great stories, I would concede, follow that storyline. Even, I'll put this out on the internet, one of the great stories of our generation, Die Hard, which opens with the crisis scene of the hostage situation and Bruce Willis, right? Our scrappy, subversive leader who's got to quietly infiltrate the bad guys so that he can save the tower full of people, right? It's his life or the hostages, right? Or the bad guys. That's the stakes. And then the plan is his quiet infiltration. And then the amazing action scenes that really make that movie, right? And then you get to live into the outcome of what happens. I won't give it all away. Daniel 6 unfolds like that. And it can be tempting to even hear that this is what the story's going to be and say that doesn't really, my life isn't that life. I'm not likely to be in a hostage situation, thanks be to God, or not likely to be in a situation where I'm one of God's prophets. But what I want to concede to you is the way that this story unfolds is meant to be an encouragement to us, an emboldening to us, a comforting way that we can live out a hoorah moment into the struggles and challenges of our own life, whether they're feeling monotonous, like they're a continuation of a lot of low stakes, that requires its own perseverance, or whether you're in the moment where you're asking the high stakes question. So I hope you'll lean in and feel like Daniel has something to speak to you today. When you picture Daniel in this story, I think you should picture Bruce Willis a little bit, the scrappy underdog. Daniel's actually 90 in this story, which, if you're familiar with Sunday school pictures of Daniel, it's usually this 16-year-old blonde kid. Not this story. He's an old man, and yet his biggest adventure is right in front of him. Most people know Daniel for Daniel and the Lion's Den. And so wherever you are in your life, just know that what's at stake is this God-sized adventure of a life that is full of joy, and the joy and struggle of overcoming, of knowing God and being known, and knowing that your life right now matters for eternity and has eternal value too. That's what's at stake. And God is inviting you to see that he likes the scrappy underdog story, and he puts his reputation on the line right there with your own. So let's get into the story of Daniel 6 and see this master story unfold as we see the stakes and the plan and the action and the outcome. When we come to Daniel, I already mentioned he's older. This is the start of Daniel 6. He's still working in the foreign government, but now he's not working for Babylon anymore. He's working for the Medes and the Persians, for a king named Darius, who is a weaker king compared to the kind of guys he's been working for before. In fact, he's manipulated by Daniel's co-workers to create a law that will mean that everyone has to pray to this king, King Darius, for 30 days. And they've done this in order to trap Daniel. They had it in for Daniel. Maybe you feel like you've got a family member or a coworker who's got it out for you. You are in good company today. So let me open the story. This is really from the bad guy's perspective in Daniel chapter 6, verse 3. This is what it says. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him up over the whole kingdom. So you see why everybody's mad about him, right? At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find the grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs. They weren't able to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God." And that's where they got this idea to make people pray to Darius for 30 days, because it puts Daniel in this crisis moment. His life is now at stake. He has to either decide he's going to obey this law, to only pray to Darius, which goes against God's law to have no gods before him, or he's going to be thrown to the lions. So this is what's at stake. The bad guys have drawn up the battle lines and have said, the way that you do your life with your God or our authority. Which would you pick? Would you put your life on the line? There's more at stake here, though, too. It's not only Daniel who's going to be alive or dead. God's reputation is actually at stake here. Either there is a God who is above all gods, who is not going to tolerate people praying to anyone other than himself, or he's going to prove to be a weaker non-entity. What's really, this is a little trivia for you about Daniel, but this is the last chapter in the book of Daniel that's written in a different language. Most of the Bible is written in Hebrew or Greek, which would be considered the language of God's people. But God here is writing to the non-churchy folks, to the people who don't know him. He's speaking in their language, in Aramaic, because God wants to be known by the whole world. His intention is that relationship with him is available to everyone. And so we get that, even in this chapter, that it's written in another language. We're going to find out whether or not the Medes and the Persians, this entire other kingdom, is going to know who God is as the rescuer. Do you feel like these are the stakes that are up for grabs in your life? Is your life on the line? Is whether or not God is the only way, the truth, and the life on the line? I think in different seasons we lean into that question differently. But whether or not you're under the death penalty, I think often I wonder, is my life worthy? Is it purposeful? And I think that you can read that into this story today. I think our lives are a high stakes story where our life and God's reputation are very much on the line. From the beginning of God's story, the very first page, it gets set up with a crisis, with a bad guy, the accuser, whose name, he's called Satan. Just in Hebrew, it's Satan, the word, the accuser. And the accuser comes with the questions to human beings that he's been asking ever since that first page. He asks, did God really say? And is God withholding from you? I think those questions are still up for grabs in our lives. That's still the seed of the battle, the seed of doubt that leads us to our own high stakes questions about who we are and who God is and what God looks like to us. I think the stakes are the same. And so then we go from the story, from the stakes to the plan. What's God's plan? God's plan is to let the battle rage. God is not afraid of a battle. I don't know if that's a comfort to you or not, but this is a Bruce Willis moment where you roll up your sleeves. You hope you've been doing your push-ups, because here we go. It's about to get hot. The fire is about to rage. I don't think any of us, well, maybe some of us would choose a life of a battle. But as I mentioned, I think that this story is meant to be a powerful comfort, that when the battle rages, when things are outside of our control, when we're struggling, when the doubt sets in, when things aren't going our way, when we're at home sick, when we don't have the answers to the questions, when it feels like everything's stacked up against us, God is trustworthy. And I think Daniel's story is meant to be a comfort to us, that God is good at these kind of moments. And it's meant to be a hoorah to our faith, to our souls, to say, yes, this is the story. I know this story. I know this plan. I know where this goes, and I'm in. And so the plan gets set in motion here in Daniel 6, and the battle begins to rage. Daniel's got to decide if he's going to pray to Darius or not. And if not, is he going to face the lions? So this is what it looks like in Daniel chapter 6, verse 10, when the first action scene, the first battle. Where do you think it is? Well, just like Die Hard, they pick the good scenes where it's on the rooftop and it's at the windows, right? Except in this space, what Daniel's doing, his action, is that he's praying. Listen to Daniel 6:10. It says, "Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before." Just as he had done before. Look, I don't know about you, but I will stand up at 10 till every hour because my watch tells me to. I'll eat at least 3 times a day because my stomach tells me that I'm hungry. How did Daniel remember? How was it his habit to pray 3 times a day? I'm suspecting that Daniel had some sort of internal alarm system, an internal warning that reminded him that the battle was going on all the time. He didn't get so distracted from his government work or from being invited to fancy dinner parties that he didn't remember that his life was a matter of life and death all the time. Did Bruce Willis in Die Hard have to be reminded to be on? No. He was in the battle and he knew it. I think Daniel was constantly aware that life was high stakes. Look at the journey we've made through Daniel. In Daniel 2, he was at the threat of being torn limb from limb based on whether or not he could interpret a dream. In Daniel 3, his friends got thrown into a fiery furnace because they wouldn't bow down to a statue, and he saw God show up in that fire. In Daniel 5, we had a crazy moment where there's like handwriting on the wall, and like a hand writing on the wall, and then that night the king dies, and Daniel's called into that moment. He knows, he has seen, his life has told him that it's a life or death moment. And I don't think when it comes to our lives, I don't think we do. And I'm not trying to harp on us here, it's just a reality that we're not at threat of being pulled limb from limb. The kind of request my boss makes of me are probably really similar to the request the boss makes of you. Asking for advisement about a difficult conversation or trying to get a task completed. It feels like a very different kind of stakes moment. But I think the last year has really amped up the stakes for a lot of us. I thought about Cindy Wilson, who's in our congregation here. She has a job that oversees the supplies for a lot of the hospitals in our area, which is an important job no matter what year it is or what's going on. But this year, it's an even higher stakes moment, right? Because her job is whether or not people have ventilators. And so I wondered, and I checked with her, I wondered if this hadn't been a faith-building year for Cindy, because seemingly low stakes suddenly seemed very high, became life or death moments. And so I checked with her, and I asked her if she's been talking to God more, and she said yes, almost desperately at times. Well, sure, this is where this whole concept of foxhole faith comes from. When life or death is on the line, we want a direct line to the big guy upstairs, right? And it's in those moments that we realize in prayer, we have access to the God of the universe, and he's listening. Now, wouldn't it be an incredible thing if we realized, if we thought about, man, the God that's up there listening to me in my life or death moments, he's listening to me all the time. He cares about me all the time. Without feeding that to Cindy, I promise, this is what she texted back. She said, it reminds me that I need to be in constant conversation with him, and not just when I feel like I'm desperate, which seems often. These life or death, high-stake moments remind us of what our souls feel like when we yearn for God, when we're desperate, when there's nothing else that we need but his rescue. Could you imagine that if you were to believe in a God who could show up in the foxhole, could you believe that that God might actually care about your trim color? That he might care about whether or not your kid's being bullied in school, or what the next presentation outcome is going to be at your job, or what the relationship is like with a coworker? Is it possible that God might want to hear from you about that too? That he might have wisdom and rescue for you in that moment? Daniel knew, he knew that he had access to God, that God was listening, that God cared about him. And so he talked to him all the time. He was always aware of that in his life. And so when it became an actual foxhole moment where it was life or death, Daniel just did what he always did. He went and prayed. So the action amps up. Daniel goes to his room to pray, and then here come the bad guys, his accusers, who catch him in his room praying. They snarkily go tell the king that he's caught, and now he has to hold up his law. Because Darius is not under God's law, he's under his own law, and he has to keep it. And Daniel has to go to the lion's den. Daniel's life's definitely on the line, but remember what else is on the line. God's reputation is on the line, because God is a rescuer. Listen to what the king says in Daniel chapter 6, verse 16. He makes it clear that God's reputation is on the line. He says, so the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. The eyes of the world are on this moment to see whether or not God is true and whether or not he's the rescuer. So will God prove to be able to rescue, and will Daniel live? This is the best of the action scenes. I can't skip a word. So listen to the rest of Daniel chapter 6 from verse 17. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, O king. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in. Oh, and then it gets really brutal. So go read the R-rated version of Daniel 6 for yourself for the unedited outcome. The outcome, as it regards Daniel, as it regards the king, is God's rescue, and God known as the rescuer. Just like the fire with Daniel's friends a couple weeks ago, how does God rescue? He sent Daniel into the battle. He didn't spare him. Did you see? Daniel actually had to go into the pitch blackness of a lion's den. He had to face the lions. But it was there in that pit that God showed up with him, sent an angel to him to protect him. Often this is how God rescues us. He doesn't spare us from battle, but he sends us into it with him. And we get to experience his rescue in the middle of it. This is why I think church planting has been difficult for me, because it's a battle. I have people come to me regularly, like apologizing to me that we were planting a church at the start of COVID, trying to form a community when everything shut down. And there is part of me, it's hard, don't get me wrong. But part of me goes, yeah, like bring it on. This is the battle, this is it. And if COVID hadn't happened, well, there'd be a completely different story. But God's story is struggle, and he shows up in it, and we're not unchanged by it. And so I'm a different person now than I was a year ago. Who we are and what we're doing, it's more clear to me. There's been pruning. It's been hard, but good. And I expect, because the story that God always writes is high stakes, his plan, which is the battle plan, action, yeah, it's tiring, innovating, and blocking, but this is where I meet God, right? This is where he shows up in the fire, in the lion's den, right? And then the outcome is not only my life spared, but God is made known. I see him for who he is. I'm reminded of who I am. I take prayer all the more seriously. I'm not unchanged. And we become a different kind of people. So would I spare all that? No, I want to be in God's story. This is how Daniel's story plays out. This is how my story plays out. If you want to do life with God, this is how your story plays out. And the outcome is life with God forever, with everyone else who wants to be with him forever. Just to drive this home that this is God's story, and that, man, he's got a deep affection for the scrappy underdog who endures against all odds. Let me just remind you of one more R-rated level story of Scripture where this plays out. God himself enters the scene. He comes to the earth. He lives as a human being, and the stakes are high. They're the lives of all humanity, the eternal life of all humanity with God in his kingdom or apart from him, and God's reputation in the world. God had been promising throughout the entire Old Testament that he was a rescuer, that he was going to come and establish his people in a promised land, that they would be a great nation, that they would have a king of the line of David on the throne forever. And after 400 years of silence, it would be easy to call all of that oral tradition, myth, and legend, and not true because it hadn't come to pass. God's reputation's on the line. So here he comes on the scene, and immediately the accusers draw up the battle lines. Jesus, from the time he's a baby, the kings are trying to kill him. The Satan, the accuser, meets him in the wilderness to tempt Jesus with the same questions that he's been tempting all of humanity with forever. Did God really say? Is not God withholding from you food and power and authority? Jesus defeats him in the desert. And then he lives a daily, ordinary life of individual moments that look like high stakes, but it's really eternity writ large in a fishing village, just like us. And then at the end of his life, Jesus is entrapped by political peers, caught in a moment of prayer. Does this sound familiar? God does not spare him the tribunal. He's brought before the king of the time, who actually doesn't want to kill him. I mean, this is just all the parallels, right? The death penalty is spoken over him. He actually has to endure the cross. Jesus dies. Daniel doesn't. Jesus dies, and when he dies, that's not the final outcome, so stick with me. He goes into a tomb where a stone is rolled over. Daniel's tomb was sealed by a signet ring. Jesus' tomb was sealed and with Roman guards so that his body would not move. The situation would not change. Early in the morning, it's not Darius that comes. In Jesus' story, it's his friends that come to tend to his body. But the stone's been rolled away. And what's in the tomb? Who was in the pit? An angel. An angel declaring that Jesus is alive. That Jesus has gone through death and conquered death. What we all thought was the outcome. And he's written a new story. A story of resurrection, of redemption, of a king who sits on a throne forever, of a people that belong to him, of an earth that is going to be restored in his image. He made good. His reputation is secure. It's true. He's the rescuer. Our lives are spared. Death is no longer the outcome. It's eternal life. And it's life with God now if we want it. Whatever pit you're in, whatever the high stakes moments are, now you get to have God with you. The story's outcome is sure. This is Daniel's story. This is Jesus' story. This is your and my story because it is the story. It's the story of God. So there's only one thing I know to do coming out of the story. Decide to join God's team. Decide to be a part of the story that he's working out in the world. Take seriously the accuser. Take seriously your high stakes moments that God actually wants to show up in them. And people who are on God's team, they live out God's battle plan, which is to pray. I want to encourage you to check out the Echo Prayer app. It's what I have downloaded. I need my reminders to stand up and I need my reminders to pray. So I've got my alarm set for 9:30, but I want to encourage you to decide when you want it. When do you most need the reminder that God is with you? Whatever that hour is of the day, plug that into the Echo Prayer app and start plugging in the things that are on your heart. God cares about them. To remember to talk to him about them. And the second thing that I want to call you to is to remember that you get to be a part of making God known in the world. His reputation really is at stake. And when was the last time that you told somebody God is awesome? I missed my chance yesterday morning. I was going through the coffee line and she asked me, how's your Monday going? And I actually said, I'm just ready to slay the day, which was true by 7:30. But previously, hours earlier, I was not feeling like that. And what I could have said that would have been equally honest is I woke up with a case of the Mondays. But I was reading an ancient saying that said that God gives peace to his children. And that began to shift my heart. And then I just got a good strength building workout in. And now I feel like I can slay the day. How about you? Maybe she needed the same word from God, from Isaiah 54:13 that I did, that God gives peace to his children. And I missed that chance. So I just want to invite you to pay attention to those moments. They're eternal moments. It may not seem like a big deal which side of the coffee, barista stand to drive through, but maybe God has a moment for you there and a word for you to share that actually changes eternity. And so I invite you into God's story. This is it. This is what it's really about. And he sees you and he's listening. So instead of clicking next episode, stop right now and pray and tell God what you care about. He so cares about you. Thank you for tuning into Chapel Hill Port Orchard. I'm Megan. I'm the pastor here, and I hope I get to see you in person sometime soon. For now, please like this video if you liked it. Click subscribe, share it with a friend who needs to know that their story matters. We are here at the Nazarene Church on Sydney and Port Orchard every Tuesday at 6:15 and have a lot of really fun things coming up this spring. So be sure to check our website, chapelhillportorchard.org, or look at our social media to see when you might join us in person. See you around.